5 years earlier, the town of Ridgeway had hummed with the simple promise of a Saturday afternoon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the tall windows of the Ridgeway Savings and Trust, illuminating the polished oak of the teller cages and the hopeful faces of the people within. A younger Eli Cutter stood in line, his arm draped easily around his wife's shoulders. Sarah was tracing the rim of the teller window with a gloved finger, a soft smile on her face as she looked back at him. In her other hand, she clutched a small leather pouch, heavy with the coins they had saved for nearly 2 years, enough for the down payment on a small plot of land just north of town. "It's really happening, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and relief. "Our own place. No more renting." Eli squeezed her gently. "Told you we'd get there." He was a different man then. The lines around his eyes were from laughter, not vigilance, and the easy way he wore his pistol was a holdover from a past he was trying to put behind him, a tool he hadn't drawn in anger for years. Sarah opened the silver locket that hung around her neck, a wedding gift from him. Inside were 2 tiny hand-painted portraits, one of Eli serious and steady, and one of herself, her eyes bright with a future she was certain of. "Soon," she said, snapping it shut, "we'll need a bigger one." "For the children." The words were still warm in the air when the front doors of the bank burst open. Chaos erupted in a deafening wave. 2 men in dusty coats, their faces obscured by bandanas, stormed in. One vaulted over the counter, his revolver sweeping across the terrified faces of the clerks. The other, a wiry man with frantic eyes, stood guard by the door, shouting for everyone to get on the floor. Panic was a physical thing, a cold shock that seized the air. People dropped, a chorus of shrieks and whimpers filling the grand room. Eli instinctively pushed Sarah behind him, his body shielding hers as he lowered them both to the marble floor. His hand went to his own weapon, not out of aggression, but out of a desperate primal need to protect the life he had built. The robber at the counter was stuffing bills into a sack, his movements jerky and unprofessional. But the one by the door was losing his nerve. A child began to cry, and the man spun, pointing his gun wildly. "Shut that kid up," he shrieked, his voice cracking. Eli saw it then, the trembling hand, the finger tightening on the trigger. This wasn't a professional job. It was desperation, and desperate men were unpredictable. He knew he had only a second. As the robber's gun drifted toward a young family huddled nearby, Eli made his choice. He drew his Colt in a single fluid motion. He thought he had forgotten a grim muscle memory from a life he'd sworn to leave behind. "Drop it." Eli's voice was low, but cut through the noise like a whip crack. The robber's head snapped toward him, his wild eyes widening in surprise. He swung his pistol around, and in that split second, the world narrowed to the space between 2 men. Eli fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The wiry man staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, and collapsed against the door, his gun clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The second robber, his face a mask of horror, abandoned the sack of money and scrambled back over the counter. He fired blindly as he fled, a wild shot meant to cover his escape. Eli didn't even see it. He was already turning back to Sarah, a word of reassurance on his lips. But it never came out. She was slumped against him, her eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade. A small dark circle had appeared on the white lace of her collar. The silver locket in her hand was dented, the chain broken. It fell from her grasp and skittered across the floor. The world went silent and cold. The sounds of the bank, the crying, the shouting, the running footsteps, faded into a dull roar in his ears. He knelt, gathering her into his arms, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. He saw the locket lying a few feet away, glinting in the dusty sunlight. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the cool metal. He clicked it open. The tiny painted portrait of himself stared back untouched. But Sarah's portrait was shattered, and the porcelain cracked by the impact of the bullet that had passed through it and then through her. He had saved a dozen strangers, but he hadn't saved the only one who mattered. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on him, shaping the man he would become. 5 years later, the guilt was still there, a constant, silent companion. It rode with him now, a cold presence in the saddle, as his horse Titan picked its way through the deepening snow. The wind howled through the pines of the high country, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in his own chest. He was on his way home from Ridgeway, the same town where he had lost everything. He had sold 2 heads of cattle and squared a debt, the kind of honest work that was supposed to cleanse a man's soul. But for Eli, every trip back was a pilgrimage to a grave. He reached into his saddlebag, his fingers brushing against the worn leather pouch where he kept his meager earnings. Beneath it, his knuckles found the familiar cool shape of the dented silver locket. He didn't need to look at it. He knew its every flaw by heart. It was his penance, a reminder of a debt he could never repay. The memory of Sarah's face, pale and still on the bank floor, rose unbidden, sharp and agonizing as ever. It was that memory that had driven him to marry again. 8 months ago, he had brought Mary home, a woman with a bright smile and kind words, hoping to give his sons the mother they deserved. He had told himself it was for them, for Sam, Joshua, and little Micah. He had tried to believe it was a second chance. The horse stopped because the rider did not, because the trail ended, or the storm let up, but because Eli Cutter saw something no man should ever have to see. Through the swirling curtain of snow, his cabin came into view, a faint yellow light glowing in the window. But on the porch, huddled together against the base of a single support post, were 3 small figures, their shapes almost lost in the white landscape. His sons. He slid from the saddle before Titan had even come to a full halt, his boots sinking into the deep snow. A cold dread far more chilling than the wind seized him. The boys were crusted with snow, their faces raw and red, their breath making faint, struggling mists in the air. But they weren't crying. They just looked up at him with dull, exhausted eyes, like they'd been waiting for the world to end. And maybe for them, it just did. Sam! The name was a choked whisper torn from his throat by the wind and his own rising panic. His eldest, not yet 10, but already carrying the weight of the world on his thin shoulders, stirred. He tried to stand, his movements stiff and agonizingly slow. Eli fell to his knees in the snow, yanking off his thick gloves. He pressed his bare hands to their coats, feeling the deep, penetrating ice in the fabric in their skin. Joshua, his middle son, was shivering uncontrollably, his face pressed into Sam's side, while little Micah, only 5, didn't even lift his head. Why, Eli's voice was sharp with a fear so profound, it felt like a physical blow. "Why are you out here?" Sam's lips, split and tinged with blue, struggled to form words. He managed only a glance toward the cabin door just 10 feet away, shut tight against the storm. The flicker of a warm fire was clearly visible in the cracks between the logs. She locked us out." The words hit Eli with the force of a physical punch. It wasn't just the cold. It was the way Sam said it, with a quiet resignation, as if it wasn't the first time. As if he expected nothing different. A wave of nausea and fury washed over Eli. He scooped Micah into his arms, the small boy curling into his chest, with a faint, instinctive whimper. He took Joshua under his other arm and urged Sam to follow his every movement, fueled by a desperate protective rage. The cabin door wasn't locked when he reached it. It swung open without a sound. Warmth washed over them, thick with the smell of stew and wood smoke. A fire roared in the hearth, and in front of it, curled in his own armchair with a cup steaming in her hand, sat Mary. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look up. "You're home early," she said flatly, her eyes fixed on the flames. Eli didn't speak. He moved with a deliberate gentleness that belied the storm raging inside him. He set Micah on the rug near the stove and began stripping off the child's soaked, frozen coat. He knelt before Joshua, working at the laces of his boots, with numb fingers trying to rub some life back into the boy's pale toes. Sam stood frozen in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the swirling snow, as if stepping inside without permission was a transgression he was no longer brave enough to commit. Finally, Eli looked up, his gaze locking onto the woman in the chair. "How long?" His voice was quiet, but it held the sharp edge of honed steel. Mary sighed, an infuriatingly casual sound. They were being noisy. "I told them to play outside." "I didn't think you'd be back until Friday." "It's near dark, Mary." Eli said, the quiet in his voice deepening into something dangerous. "There's a blizzard coming in." "They have coats," she replied with a shrug, finally taking a sip from her cup. "Don't see the harm in a little cold. Builds grit." Eli rose slowly to his full height. He wasn't a man prone to shouting. His anger had always been a cold, quiet thing. But the heat building in his chest now was different. It was the white-hot fury of a father whose trust had been utterly betrayed. "They're children," he said, each word a carefully placed stone. "My children. They're not mine." She snapped, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. The mask was gone. In that moment, Eli Cutter saw her for the first time. The pretty face he had mistaken for warmth, the hands that never softened, the sweet smile that was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, it all fell away. Beneath it was a stranger, a woman with a core of ice so cold it could freeze a child on a doorstep without a flicker of remorse. He had married her out of a desperate, lonely hope to give his sons a mother, willfully ignoring the small warnings his gut had been sending him for months, of the way she never held Micah for more than a second, and the sharp tone she used with Joshua when she thought he wasn't listening, and the subtle distance she always kept from Sam. He had ignored it all because he wanted so desperately to believe he had done the right thing for them. He saw now that he had brought a viper into his home. The whispered rumors in the nearby town of Bitter Hollow suddenly made a chilling kind of sense. He had always been an outsider there, his past as a gunslinger, a story told in hushed tones around saloon tables and pot-bellied stoves. They saw him as a man of violence, a relic of a wilder time, not as a grieving father trying to raise 3 boys on his own. He had no deep roots there, no allies who would speak for him without question. He was the quiet man in the isolated cabin, the one with a past. A woman like Mary, with her practiced smiles and demure church appearances, could easily paint him as the villain. He realized with a sickening lurch that the town would believe whatever story she chose to tell. The realization didn't cool his anger. It focused it. He stood between her and the fire, his shadow falling over her, and the warmth in the cabin suddenly felt false, suffocating. "You can pack, Eli," said his voice, as even and cold as the winter outside. Mary blinked, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her features. "What? You heard me." She set her cup down with a sharp clink, her composure cracking. "You're throwing me out in a blizzard over this." Eli didn't answer her directly. He turned away from her, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any insult, and walked to the hook by the door. He took down another thick wool blanket and wrapped it around Sam's thin, trembling shoulders, gently guiding his eldest son fully inside. He closed the door behind them, the heavy thud sealing out the storm and sealing in the suffocating tension. The night passed in a near-complete silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rustle of quilts as the boys, finally warm and safe, slept fitfully in their father's bed. Eli did not sleep. He sat in a hard-backed chair against the wall, his rifle propped beside him, his eyes never leaving the woman who sat across the room. She didn't weep or beg. She didn't try to explain or apologize. She simply packed a small bag with a cold, methodical fury. By morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving the world pristine and silent under a blanket of white. And she was gone. The boys didn't ask where she went, and a part of Eli wanted to leave it at that. But the quiet horror of what he had found on the porch demanded the whole truth. Later, while Joshua and Micah were still asleep, he sat with Sam by the fire. "It wasn't just last night, was it?" he asked quietly. Sam stared into the flames, shame and fear warring in his young face. He shook his head. He spoke in a whisper, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken. It had been this way for months, ever since Eli started leaving for longer trips. The moment his horse was out of sight, Mary's kindness vanished. Meals were skipped, chores were doubled. Punishments were cruel and inventive, standing in the corner for hours, sleeping in the cold woodshed, and yes, being locked outside. She said, if we told you, she'd make sure you didn't come back next time. Sam whispered, a single tear finally tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. She said you'd believe her over us. Eli closed his eyes, and the confession, a knife twisting in his gut. He remembered it all now, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The bruises Sam had claimed were from falling off the woodpile. The odd tense silence that greeted him whenever he returned. The way Joshua would flinch if a voice was raised too suddenly. The desperate way little Micah clung to his leg every time he had to leave. He should have seen it. A fool blinded by his own grief and loneliness had invited the wolf to guard his lambs. Mary would not go quietly. She would go to town to Sheriff Greeley, a man who had always looked at Eli with suspicion. She would twist this turn, his righteous anger, into proof of the very violence she had invented. Her parting words as she'd slammed the door that morning echoed in his mind. "You'll regret this, Eli." She had hissed, her face contorted with a chilling malice he now understood all too well. People listened to a grieving woman. It wasn't just a threat. It was the opening move in a war he had just realized he was fighting. 2 days later, the sound of approaching horses broke the fragile peace of the valley. Eli was splitting logs by the barn, and the rhythmic thud of the axe for the only sound besides the boys' quiet chatter from inside the cabin. He paused axe in mid-swing and looked toward the ridge. 2 riders, their figures dark against the snow. One sat tall in the saddle with an air of officialdom. The other was slighter, younger. He recognized them instantly, Sheriff Greeley and his deputy, a nervous young man named Peters. This was not a posse of hired thugs. This was worse. This was the law, and it was coming for him. He set the axe down and walked to the cabin, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. "Boys, stay inside," he said, his voice calm. Sam appeared at the door, his eyes wide with apprehension. "It's the sheriff, Sam. Just stay quiet and let me handle it." Eli stepped onto the porch as the riders reined in their horses. Sheriff Greeley was a man whose authority came more from the weight of his gut than the weight of his badge. He had a florid face and small, suspicious eyes that were currently fixed on Eli as if he were a bug under glass. "Cutter," Greeley said, not bothering with a greeting. He swung a leg over his saddle, his boots crunching in the snow. Deputy Peters followed, looking anywhere but at Eli. Sheriff Eli replied, his tone even. "Got a complaint filed against you," Greeley announced, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "From your wife, Mary." He said her name as if it were a synonym for victim. "She rode into town 2 nights ago, half frozen. Told quite a story. Said you beat her, threw her out into a blizzard without so much as a coat." "She's lying," Eli said simply. Greeley's eyes narrowed. "She had bruises, Cutter. Looked convincing to me. Said you've been doing the same to those boys. Said she was trying to protect them when you flew into a rage." The accusation was so monstrous, so inverted from the truth, that for a moment Eli couldn't breathe. He saw Mary's plan laid bare. It wasn't just about making him look bad. It was about taking his sons. "She locked my boys out of this cabin in that same blizzard," Sheriff Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "I found them freezing on that porch." "You can ask them yourself," Greeley scoffed. "Oh, I'm sure they'll say whatever their pa tells them to say, especially a pa with your reputation." He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. It wasn't a direct threat, but a reminder of where the power lay. "Mary says you're unstable, unfit, She's filed a petition with the circuit judge for custody. Says she wants to take them somewhere safe. The cabin door creaked open. Sam stood there, his small frame rigid. He hadn't been told to come out, but he had come anyway. He looked directly at the sheriff, his child's face set with a man's resolve. She's the one who hurt us. Sam said, his voice clear and steady. She called us names. She didn't feed us sometimes, and she put us outside. Pa saved us. Greeley looked down at the boy, momentarily thrown by his quiet conviction. But he recovered quickly, his skepticism hardening his features again. A boy will defend his father, especially if he's scared of him. Deputy Peters shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff, maybe we should... We're doing our job. Peters Greeley snapped, cutting him off. He turned his glare back to Eli. This is a formal warning, Cutter. I've got men in town who heard Mary's story. Good men. They don't take kindly to women and children being mistreated. The judge will be through here in a few weeks. Until then, you watch your step. Any more trouble, and I'll be back with a warrant and enough men to drag you out of here in chains. He didn't ask to see the other boys. He didn't inspect the cabin. He had come with his mind made up. Mary's lies had found fertile ground in the town's distrust of him. Greeley and his deputy mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Eli watched them go, a cold certainty settling over him. He could not win here. He could not wait for a judge who would arrive weeks from now, after Mary and Greeley had spent that time poisoning every well in the county against him. The law was not on his side. It had already chosen one. He had to go to the law himself, to the only man he believed might still be impartial. He had to find Judge Amos Traylor. The decision was made in the cold clarity that follows a threat. They would leave at dawn. Packing was a grim, hurried affair. Not everything, just what mattered: blankets, dried meat, ammunition, and the worn leather-bound book that had been Sarah's. Eli worked with a focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. The boys, sensing the gravity of the situation, worked alongside him in silence. They were loading the last of the provisions onto their pack mule when a sound from the edge of the woods made Eli freeze. It was the snap of a twig, too deliberate for an animal. He motioned for the boys to get behind the cabin and raised his rifle. A small figure emerged from the dense pines, hesitant and thin. It was a girl no older than Sam, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Her face was smudged with dirt, and a nasty-looking bruise purpled one side of her cheek. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice small but clear. "I'm not with them." Eli lowered the rifle but kept his guard up. "With who?" "The sheriff," she said, taking a tentative step forward. "And the woman. I heard them talking in town." Eli's focus sharpened. "What's your name?" "Clara." "What did you hear, Clara?" Her story came out in a nervous rush. She had been hiding out in the livery stable in Bitter Hollow, on the run from an abusive stepfather. A man who Eli noted with a grim twist in his gut was one of Sheriff Greeley's regular poker buddies. She had overheard Greeley talking to Mary in his office. Mary wasn't just spinning a tale of abuse, she was plotting. Greeley had advised her on how to file the petition, telling her which lies would be most effective. Clara had heard Mary say something that had chilled her to the bone. She said it was time for her family to get justice. Clara recounted, her eyes wide with the memory. She said the name Cutter would be nothing but a sad story by the time she was done. A cold dread washed over Eli. Justice for her family. The phrase felt wrong, too personal for a woman he'd known less than a year. It was more than a cruel whim. It was something else, something deeper. As Clara finished her story, Eli noticed a piece of paper sticking out from under a loose floorboard on the porch, a spot where Mary used to sit and mend clothes. He knelt and pulled it out. It was a photograph, old and creased. It showed a younger Mary, her arm linked with a wiry young man with frantic, familiar eyes. They were smiling, standing in front of what looked like a small, tidy farmhouse. Eli stared at the man's face. There was something about him he couldn't place a flicker of a memory that was dark and violent. He shook his head, unable to grasp it, and tucked the photograph into his coat pocket. It was just another piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. "Where are you headed?" Clara asked, her gaze fixed on the packed mule. "To Dry Hollow," Eli said. "To see Judge Traylor. Can I come with you?" The question was so direct, so devoid of pleading, that it took Eli by surprise. "My stepfather. He'll be looking for me. I'm safer on the move. And I can testify for you. I can tell the judge what I heard." Looking at the determined set of her jaw and the fear she was trying so hard to hide, Eli saw another child in need of protection. "Get your things," he said. "We ride in 5 minutes." The journey to Dry Hollow was a harsh education in survival. The trail wound through treacherous snow-choked canyons and across windswept plateaus. Mary's reach, Eli soon discovered, was longer than he'd anticipated. On the second day, Sam spotted them 3 riders on the ridge above, moving with the practiced ease of skilled trackers. They weren't sent by the sheriff. These men were different, quieter, more dangerous. Mary had hired them. What followed was a tense game of cat and mouse. Eli used every bit of knowledge he had from his past life to stay ahead of them. He taught Sam how to read the tracks, how to tell the age of a horse's print by the sharpness of its edge in the snow. He showed him how to use the terrain, sticking to rocky ground, where they would leave less sign-crossing streams to break their trail. The pursuit forced them into a silent, efficient unit. Clara proved to be surprisingly resilient, her quiet vigilance a constant asset. She spotted a scout on a bluff that Eli had missed and helped keep the younger boys calm and quiet when they had to hide for hours in a thicket of icy aspens as the trackers passed less than 100 yards away. During one of those long, cold waits, huddled together for warmth, Eli saw Sam studying the old photograph he had found. "Who's that with her?" Sam asked quietly. "Don't know," Eli admitted. "Says on the back, with my dear brother Thomas." "He looks scared," Sam observed. Eli looked at the photo again. Sam was right. Behind the smile, the young man's eyes held the same frantic energy as the bank robber he had shot 5 years ago. But the connection was still just beyond his reach, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He put the photo away, the seed of unease it had planted growing deeper. On the 3rd night, a sudden vicious storm descended from the mountains, forcing them to take shelter in a shallow cave carved into the side of a granite cliff. The wind shrieked outside, whipping snow into a frenzy. Inside the small fire they managed to build cast dancing, distorted shadows on the rock walls. The world felt compressed, claustrophobic. The boys and Clara were asleep, huddled together under a pile of blankets. Eli watched the photograph of Mary and her brother resting on his knee. He couldn't shake the feeling it held an answer. He stared at it, the flickering firelight playing tricks with the image, making the faces seem to move. He traced the young man's face with his thumb. Thomas. Justice for her family. The words echoed in his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to force the memory. The bank in Ridgeway. The shouting. The chaos. The face of the desperate man by the door. And then it hit him. It was a gut punch, a wave of ice that washed through his entire body, leaving him breathless and shaking. The frantic eyes. The wiry frame. The way his mouth was set in a line of panicked desperation. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was him. The man in the photograph, Mary's brother Thomas, was the bank robber he had killed 5 years ago. Her real name wasn't Mary Cutter. It was Mary Crowley. He remembered the name from the trial, a detail lost in the haze of his grief. Thomas Crowley, the man who had inadvertently caused Sarah's death. The entire marriage, the past 8 months of his life, was a lie. It wasn't a second chance. It was a long, meticulously planned con. She hadn't married him for a home or for a father for his children. She had married him to get inside his life, to find his greatest vulnerability, and to destroy him from within. She wanted to take his sons, the only thing he had left to love, to make him feel the same gaping loss that she had felt when her brother died. She wasn't just a cruel stepmother. She was an avenging angel of the most patient and terrible kind. He looked over at his sleeping sons, their innocent faces illuminated by the fire. He had willingly brought the sister of the man he killed into his home, into their lives. He had given her the keys to his world, and she was now using them to burn it all to the ground. He finally understood. She would never stop. This wasn't about custody or getting her way. This was about annihilation. She wouldn't be satisfied until he had lost everything just as she believed she had. The fight for his sons wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a blood feud. The revelation changed everything. The cold dread that had been his companion now sharpened into a knife's edge of grim certainty. He was no longer just running to the law. He was running from a vendetta that would not be satisfied by any court. Mary wouldn't rely on trackers alone now. Knowing he was heading for a judge, she would escalate. She would send someone to stop him permanently. He pushed them harder the next day. The urgency, a silent whip at their backs. They traveled through a narrow canyon, past the sheer rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, amplifying the sound of their horses' hooves. It was a perfect place for an ambush. He was waiting for them at a bend in the canyon, a lone figure on a black horse. He was a tall man, dressed in a long dark duster, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He didn't look like a common thug. He looked like a professional. As they drew closer, Eli saw two more men positioned on the ledges above, rifles glinting in the pale sunlight. The man on the horse raised a hand. "That's far enough, Cutter." His voice was calm, devoid of emotion. "My name is Finch. Mrs. Crowley has posted a substantial bounty for the return of her property. She'd prefer the boys unharmed. She didn't say anything about you." Eli reined in tight, in his hand hovering over his pistol. "They're my sons. They're not property." Finch offered a thin, mirthless smile. "That's a matter for the courts to decide. I'm just here to fulfill a contract." He gestured with his chin to the men on the ledges. "You can't win this. Make it easy on yourself." Eli knew Finch was right. A straight firefight would be suicide. But he also knew he could not kill these men. If he arrived in Dry Hollow with 3 bodies in his wake, he would prove Mary's lies true. He had to be smarter. He had to be better. He glanced at Sam and Clara. He saw the same understanding in their eyes. They were no longer just children he was protecting. They were part of the fight. Clara Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "When I move, take the mule and the young ones back around that rockfall. Stay low." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Sam, you see that loose shale on the ledge to your right, above the first man?" Sam's eyes followed his father's gaze. He nodded. "I'm going to draw their fire. You create a distraction." It was a terrible risk asking his son to put himself in the line of fire. But it was the only way. "Wait for my signal." Eli spurred Titan forward, not charging, but moving into the open. "You want me, Finch? Come and get me." As he'd expected, Finch and the man on the opposite ledge raised their rifles. In that instant, Eli shouted, "Now Sam!" Sam, with a strength born of desperation, heaved a large rock toward the shale pile. It struck with a clatter, triggering a small avalanche of rock and scree that cascaded down the cliffside right above the first rifleman. The man yelled in surprise and scrambled to avoid being buried, his rifle clattering down the rocks. The distraction was all Eli needed. He fired twice, not at the men, but at the rock face just beside them. The bullets ricocheted, whining dangerously close, forcing Finch and the remaining riflemen to duck for cover. In that moment of chaos, Clara yanked the mule's lead, pulling Joshua and Micah behind the relative safety of a large boulder outcropping. Finch recovered quickly, firing a shot that kicked up dust near Titan's hooves. Eli was already moving, sliding from his saddle and using the horse for cover. He fired again this time, aiming for the rifleman's perch. He didn't aim to kill, but to disable. The bullet struck the sandstone just below the man's feet, shattering the rock and sending him tumbling backward out of sight. Now it was just him and Finch. The bounty hunter was good, his shots precise. But Eli was fighting for more than money. He was fighting for the lives of his children. He anticipated Finch's next move, rolling to the side as a bullet tore through the spot where he'd just been. He came up firing his shot, hitting the pommel of Finch's saddle. The bounty hunter's horse shied violently, unseating him. Finch landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. Eli was on him in a second, the barrel of his Colt pressed against Finch's temple. The bounty hunter lay on the ground, gasping for air, his cold composure finally broken. "It's over," Eli said, his voice ragged. He didn't kill him. He took his guns, tied his hands, and left him by the trail with the 2 other men who were injured but alive. He had proven he was not the murderer Mary claimed he was. More importantly, his family had fought together, a cohesive, determined unit. As they rode away, leaving the bounty hunters in the dust, Sam rode closer to his father, a new steely confidence in his eyes. They were survivors. They reached Dry Hollow at dusk, a dusty, wind-beaten town clinging to the edge of the plains. Judge Amos' trailer was exactly as Eli remembered him, old, sharp-eyed, and radiating an aura of weary integrity. He listened to Eli's story in his chambers, his face impassive, as Eli laid out everything: Mary's cruelty, the flight from Bitter Hollow, the confrontation with Finch, and finally, the devastating revelation about Mary's true identity. Clara gave her testimony, her voice shaking but firm. "She's a liar, but she's a clever one," Amos said when they were done steepling his fingers. "She's using the law as a weapon. The only way to fight it is with the truth presented under oath." He sighed, the weight of years in the sound. "I'll convene an emergency hearing, first thing in the morning. But be warned, Eli, she'll know you're here, and she won't come alone." The judge was right. Dawn broke with a strange yellow light on the horizon. The wind began to pick up, whipping dust and sand into the air, a precursor to one of the violent storms that could scour the plains clean. Just as Judge Traylor was calling the makeshift court to order in the town's single-room courthouse, they arrived. It was a posse. Sheriff Greeley was at its head, his face a mask of smug authority. Beside him rode Mary, perched elegantly on a fine mare, her expression one of profound and practiced sorrow. Behind them were a half-dozen hard-faced men, all armed. They weren't there for a hearing. They were there to take the boys by force. "Amos, I have a warrant here signed by a higher authority." Greeley boomed, dismounting and waving a piece of paper. "It grants me the authority to take custody of these children and arrest this man for assault and kidnapping. Your warrant is meaningless in my courtroom." Greeley, Amos retorted, stepping out onto the courthouse porch. "This ain't your courtroom anymore, old man." Mary said, her voice cutting through the rising wind. "This is justice." The standoff shattered. One of Greeley's men drew his gun. The world exploded into chaos just as the sandstorm hit, engulfing the small town in a blinding, roaring whirlwind of dust. Visibility dropped to near zero. Figures became fleeting ghosts in the brown maelstrom. Eli shoved his sons and Clara back inside the courthouse. "Stay down," he yelled over the howl of the wind. The fight spilled into the street, a chaotic dance of shadows and muzzle flashes. Eli used the storm as cover, moving from the courthouse to the relative safety of the blacksmith shop next door. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal, gunpowder, and grit. Through the swirling sand, he saw her. Mary had taken cover behind a water trough near the stable, a small pistol in her hand. This was where it had to end. He moved toward her, the storm concealing his approach. He cornered her between the stable wall and a stack of hay bales. The wind ripped at them, tearing their words from their lips. It was never about the boys, was it? Eli yelled, his voice raw. It was about your brother, Thomas. Her face caked with dust, twisted in a snarl of pure hatred. You took him from me. You shot him down in that bank like a dog. He was robbing the place. He was going to kill a child. He wouldn't have, she screamed, her grief and rage finally pouring out. He wasn't a criminal. It was his first time, his only time. Our mother was dying. We needed money for medicine. And the bank had turned us down. He was desperate. He was a good man. And you killed him for a bag of money. The revelation struck Eli with the force of a physical blow, a secondary twist that complicated everything. He hadn't killed a hardened outlaw. He had killed a desperate boy trying to save his mother. The gray morality of his own past action washed over him the guilt he carried for Sarah, now intertwined with this new, terrible knowledge. He saw not a villain before him, but a woman broken by a tragedy he had helped create. His hesitation was her opportunity. She raised her pistol, her hand shaking. But before she could fire, a shape lunged out of the dust storm. It was Sam. He threw himself at Mary, not with the force of an attacker, but with the dead weight of a desperate child, knocking her arm wide. The gun went off the bullet, splintering the stable wall. Before Mary could recover, Eli was on her, disarming her, pinning her against the wall. The fight was over. As the sandstorm began to subside, Judge Amos, his own pistol still smoking, had Sheriff Greeley and the remaining posse members on their knees. The law, true and final, had prevailed. As dawn broke, the storm settled, washing the sky clean. The air was cool and calm. The falling action began in Judge Amos's office, a quiet space that smelled of old books and justice. Mary and Greeley were locked in the town's small jail, awaiting transfer to a federal marshal. Mary, stripped of her righteous fury, was just a small, silent woman, consumed by her own hate. Amos confirmed that she would face justice for conspiracy assault and filing false claims. Her story is done, Eli the judge said, pouring him a cup of coffee, but Eli knew his wasn't. Later that morning, he gathered his sons and Clara by the creek that ran behind the town. The water flowed clear over smooth stones. For the first time, without the weight of an immediate threat, he told them everything. He told them about their mother, Sarah, not just about how she died, but about how she lived her laugh, the way she hummed when she baked her dream of a home filled with children. He then told them about the bank robbery, about the choice he had made, and the guilt he had carried every day since. He spoke of Thomas Crowley, not as a villain, but as a desperate young man, and of Mary, a sister whose grief had curdled into a terrible, all-consuming revenge. He released the years of guilt, laying the truth bare before his children, not as a confession, but as a foundation on which they could all rebuild. Sam listened, his face solemn, and when Eli was finished, he simply said, "It wasn't your fault, Pa." Joshua and Micah, too young to grasp the full complexity, understood the heart of it. They leaned against their father, a silent, powerful show of solidarity. Eli then turned to Clara. "You have a home with us," he said, the words both a question and a promise. "For as long as you want it." Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. She nodded, unable to speak. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, amidst the dust and sorrow of Dry Hollow, they were no longer a man and the children he was protecting. They were a family forged and tempered in the crucible of hardship. Part 10. The Resolution and Final Surprise. Months later, the dust of Dry Hollow was a distant memory. Judge Amos, true to his word, had helped Eli secure title to a small, abandoned homestead in a secluded valley, 2 counties over a place where the Cutter name meant nothing. They were rebuilding their lives, not just the dilapidated cabin, but their very souls. The seasons turned. Summer brought green life to the valley. The days fell into a peaceful rhythm of hard work and quiet healing. It was a montage of small sacred moments, Eli patiently teaching Joshua to read from Sarah's worn book. Sam, now tall and confident, managing their small herd of livestock with a skill that belied his years. Clara's laughter, once a rarity, now a frequent and welcome sound, as she and Micah chased butterflies in the meadow. The cabin, once broken and empty, was now filled with the warmth of stew on the fire and the low murmur of family. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer haunted the daylight hours. They were memories softened by time and acceptance. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the western ridge, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eli sat on the porch watching his family. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dented silver locket. He clicked it open and looked at the two portraits inside his own and the cracked, faded image of Sarah. For 5 years it had been a symbol of his failure, a constant, heavy reminder of his guilt. But now, looking at her smiling face, he felt not sadness, but a deep and abiding love. He called Sam over. His son stood before him, no longer a boy, but a young man on the cusp of his own life. "This was your mother's," Eli said, holding out the locket. "I've carried it for a long time to remind me of what I lost. But I think it's time it reminded us of what we had." He placed it in Sam's hand. "It's time to remember her with love, not with sadness. She would have been so proud of you." "Oh." Sam closed his hand around it, his eyes meeting his father's in a moment of perfect, unspoken understanding. He no longer needed it as a symbol of guilt. Joshua, Micah, and Clara joined them on the porch. Together, the 5 of them stood and watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. They were a patchwork family, scarred but resilient, a complete and unbreakable unit forged in the heart of the fire. Their story was not one of mere survival, but of rebirth of peace, found not in the absence of hardship, but in the strength to face it together.